"You're not supposed to matter," Queen Seraphina said quietly, signing the marriage decree without looking at him. And the room seemed to agree as Ethan Blake stood exactly where they placed him, half a step behind the ceremonial line, just close enough to be seen, far enough to be ignored, like a piece of furniture that had learned how to breathe. The palace itself watched in its own way, walls of living metal adjusting their glow as if measuring the weight of the decision, while nobles in polished uniforms whispered in tones carefully calibrated to sound respectful and still carry judgment across 20 feet of marble floor. A political union, they called it, a necessary alignment between a rising empire and a human colony that had nothing to offer except location and compliance. And Ethan understood that perfectly well, which was why he didn't bother correcting anyone when they avoided his name. He adjusted the sleeve of a suit that had been tailored precisely enough to remind him he didn't belong in it, glanced once at the ceiling where faint lines of energy pulsed like a slow heartbeat, and decided the architecture here had better posture than most people he knew. "Stand here," a royal attendant had told him earlier, placing him with the same care one might use for an object that could be replaced if misplaced, and Ethan had nodded because arguing with gravity rarely improved the situation. Across the chamber, Queen Seraphina sat elevated on a throne that seemed less built than persuaded into existence, her posture exact, her long, elegant ears angled in that neutral position he'd already learned meant she was thinking 3 moves ahead of everyone else, and possibly a 4th she hadn't decided to use yet. She hadn't spoken to him directly since his arrival, which was efficient, he supposed, fewer opportunities for either of them to pretend this was anything other than strategy. And yet when her gaze passed over him, brief, clinical, dismissive, it lingered half a second longer than it needed to, as if something didn't quite add up and she intended to solve it later. Ethan looked away first, not out of deference, but because staring at royalty usually complicated things, and he preferred his complications manageable. A low hum moved through the floor beneath his boots, subtle enough that most wouldn't notice, but he felt it the way you feel a storm before you see it. And for a moment his expression almost changed before settling back into something comfortably unremarkable. "You understand your role," an advisor had told him during the briefing, voice smooth as glass. "You are here to fulfill an agreement." And Ethan had smiled faintly because that was the kind of sentence that sounded final until reality decided otherwise. Now, as the ceremony progressed with perfect, measured precision, he folded his hands behind his back and listened to the language he wasn't supposed to understand drifting through the chamber like layered music, catching fragments without reacting, translating instinctively, and then pretending he hadn't, because sometimes knowing too much was just another way to get removed from the room. The court continued, the queen signed, the alliance sealed in ink and silence, and somewhere deep in the palace, something ancient stirred just enough to notice him, as if a system long dormant had glanced up from its sleep, and, for the briefest moment, hesitated. "You heard that too, did you not?" the queen said without turning, her voice low enough that it should have been lost beneath the ceremonial echoes, and yet it reached Ethan with unsettling clarity as the chamber slowly resumed its movement, nobles shifting, attendants stepping forward, the illusion of normalcy carefully reassembled around something no one had acknowledged. Ethan kept his posture steady, eyes forward, because answering a question not meant for him was a good way to shorten one's stay in a royal palace. But silence, he had learned, could also be interpreted as an answer, and that rarely ended well either. The hum beneath the floor faded, leaving behind a faint aftertaste in the air, like static that had decided to behave, and for a moment he wondered if he had imagined it, which would have been convenient, if not entirely convincing. "Human," Seraphina continued, this time turning her head just enough that her gaze landed on him directly, precise and measuring. "Step forward." And the request was not loud, not forceful, but the room responded to it anyway, conversations thinning, attention redirecting, the kind of silence that did not ask for permission settling over the court. Ethan took exactly 1 step forward, no more, no less, because anything extra would suggest intention. And intention in a place like this required explanation. "Did you notice a disturbance?" one of the advisors interjected. Voice smooth but edged with concern he tried to disguise as curiosity. "Or are we indulging coincidence?" Ethan considered the question, then glanced briefly at the polished floor beneath his boots as if it might offer a more diplomatic answer. I noticed the building has opinions, he said finally, tone even, almost conversational, and somewhere to his left, someone inhaled sharply, not because of what he said, but because of how casually he said it. Seraphina's ears shifted a fraction, not quite forward, not quite back. A subtle adjustment that suggested interest had replaced dismissal, at least temporarily. Explain, she said, and the single word carried weight without effort, like gravity deciding to be noticed. Ethan exhaled slowly, not out of nerves, but because the room felt like it was listening, and he preferred to speak to people, not architecture. The resonance changed, he said, choosing his words with care, like something recalibrated, briefly, then stopped when it realized it was not supposed to. A pause followed, not long, but deliberate, the kind that stretched just enough to make everyone aware of it. One of the senior engineers stepped forward, clearly uncomfortable. That is not possible, Your Majesty. All systems are stable and have been for decades. Ethan nodded slightly, as if agreeing with a reasonable point. That is what makes it interesting, he replied. And this time the silence that followed felt different, less dismissive, more cautious. Like the room had decided to pay attention after all. Seraphina studied him, not as a political necessity now, but as a variable she had not accounted for, and Ethan recognized that look because he had seen it before, in different places, on different faces, always just before something complicated happened. You speak as if you are familiar with our systems, she said, her voice softer now, but sharper in intent. And Ethan allowed himself the smallest hint of a smile, the kind that did not reach his eyes. I speak as someone who listens when something changes, he answered, and it was not a denial, which was precisely the problem. Around them, the court remained perfectly still, waiting for the queen to decide whether this conversation was insignificant or dangerous, and somewhere deep within the palace, that faint, almost forgotten presence stirred again, just enough to suggest that whatever had noticed him before had not entirely gone back to sleep then. We will test that, the queen said, and the words did not rise, they settled, like something inevitable deciding it had waited long enough, and the court shifted again, this time not out of ceremony but anticipation, the kind that made even the walls seem more attentive. Ethan did not move immediately because tests, in places like this, were rarely about answers and more about what those answers revealed to everyone watching, and he preferred his revelations limited, if possible, but the faint hum beneath the floor returned, softer now, almost patient, as if whatever had stirred before was no longer asking for permission. Seraphina stood, the throne subtly reshaping as she stepped away from it, her presence altering the balance of the room without effort, and as she descended the few steps toward the central platform, every eye followed her, then him, then back again. The entire court recalculating a situation that had stopped being simple. Bring the core online, she said, and this time several attendants hesitated before moving, which was new. Hesitation was not a quality usually permitted in a palace that prided itself on precision, but they obeyed, activating a circular structure embedded into the floor, a ring of pale light forming, rising slowly, like a thought taking shape. Ethan glanced at it once and felt something in his chest tighten in recognition he did not allow himself to name, because naming things made them real, and real things demanded explanation. This system predates our current empire, one of the engineers said quickly, as if context might restore control. It is not designed for interaction. Ethan nodded slightly. That makes two of us, he murmured, mostly to himself, though the room heard it anyway. The light intensified, forming layered patterns that shifted with a logic too precise to be decorative, and for a moment, nothing happened, which should have been reassuring, except the silence that followed felt staged, like a pause in a conversation where everyone already knew the next line. Step forward, Seraphina said again, closer now, her voice quieter, but no less absolute, and this time Ethan did not hesitate, because the alternative was pretending this was still avoidable, and it was not. He stepped into the edge of the light, just enough for the system to notice him, and the effect was immediate, subtle, but unmistakable. The pattern stilled, not frozen, but focused, like a lens adjusting until the image became clear. Somewhere behind him, someone whispered that it was a calibration response, routine, expected, and Ethan almost smiled because that was the kind of explanation people offered when reality refused to cooperate. He extended his hand slightly, not touching the core, not yet, just close enough that the air between them seemed to hold its breath, and for a fraction of a second, nothing happened, which would have been convenient, except the system did not disengage. It waited. Seraphina's gaze sharpened, her ears angling forward now, no longer neutral, no longer detached, and when she spoke again, it was not to the court, not even to the system, it was to him. "You have seen this before," she said, not a question, not quite an accusation, something more precise than either. Ethan exhaled slowly, eyes still on the shifting light. "No," he said, and then, after the smallest pause, "Not exactly," which was worse, because it meant close enough to matter. The air changed again, not louder, not brighter, just aware, and deep within the structure beneath the palace, something old and very patient made a decision it had not needed to make in a very long time. The system did not activate. It recognized, and the difference settled into the room with a weight no one could quite measure as the light surrounding Ethan shifted from ambient to deliberate, patterns aligning with a precision that felt less like machinery and more like memory remembering something it had misplaced. He did not touch the core, not yet, because whatever was happening had already crossed the line between coincidence and consequence, and stepping further would only confirm what everyone was beginning to suspect. Behind him, the engineers were no longer offering explanations, their silence sharper now, professional confidence replaced by careful observation, as if speaking too soon might make the situation worse. Seraphina moved closer, not enough to breach the boundary of the light, but close enough that the subtle changes in her expression became visible, the controlled calm still there, but threaded now with something else, something that had not been present when she signed the decree. "It is responding to you," she said, her voice low, controlled, but no longer dismissive, and Ethan allowed himself a small glance toward her before returning his attention to the shifting patterns. "That seems to be the trend," he replied, tone even, though the faintest edge of dry humor slipped through, because if he did not keep it grounded, the moment might start to feel larger than he was willing to admit. The light pulsed once, not brighter, but deeper, as if acknowledging the exchange, and then, slowly, a new layer unfolded within the core, symbols emerging that had not been visible before, complex and precise, arranged in sequences that suggested intent rather than function. A quiet ripple moved through the court, not panic, not even alarm, but the collective realization that they were witnessing something that did not fit into existing categories. "Those sequences are restricted," one advisor said, more to himself than to anyone else. "They require authorization that no one in this room possesses." And that statement hung there, incomplete, because the implication had already arrived. Ethan tilted his head slightly, studying the symbols with a familiarity he did not comment on, his brow tightening just enough to suggest recognition without confirming it. And for a moment, he considered pretending he did not understand, letting the system resolve itself, walking away before the situation became irreversible. But the core did not dim. It waited, patient in a way that suggested it had time he did not. "Ethan Blake," Seraphina said, and this time she used his full name, not the generic designation the court had relied on, and the shift was small but unmistakable. The difference between addressing an object and acknowledging a person. He glanced at her again, more directly now, and saw the change in her eyes, not warmth, not yet, but focus, as if she had decided he was no longer a variable she could ignore. "If you know what this is," she continued, "you will explain it." And there was no threat in her tone, which somehow made the request heavier, because it meant she expected an answer, not compliance. Ethan exhaled slowly, his gaze returning to the core. "It is not just responding," he said carefully, choosing each word with the same precision the system seemed to favor. "It is identifying." The last word settled into the space between them, and for a moment, nothing moved, not the court, not the attendants, not even the light, as if the entire room had paused to confirm it had heard correctly. Then, without warning, the core shifted again. The patterns locking into place, the symbols aligning into a configuration so exact it felt final, and a single tone resonated through the chamber, low, clear, and unmistakably deliberate, not loud enough to overwhelm, but precise enough to command attention. And in that tone was something else, something that did not belong to the present moment, something older, something that had just finished making a decision about him. The tone did not fade. It settled into the structure of the room as if it belonged there, as if it had always belonged there and everyone else had simply forgotten, and Ethan felt it more than he heard it. A precise alignment that ran through the floor, through the air, through him, and for the first time since stepping into the palace, he stopped pretending it was unfamiliar. The core shifted again, not outward, not dramatic, but inward, focusing its light into a narrow column that hovered inches from his hand, waiting, not for permission, but for completion. No one spoke, not even the advisors who had filled every silence before, because this silence was not empty. It was occupied, dense with the kind of certainty that made interruption feel like a mistake. Seraphina did not move, but her presence sharpened, her attention no longer divided between court and ceremony, now fixed entirely on him. And when she spoke, it was quieter than before. "Do not hesitate," she said. And it was not an order, not entirely. Something closer to trust offered before it had been earned. Ethan let out a slow breath, glancing once at the edge of the light where it met the polished floor, then at his own hand, as if confirming it still belonged to him. "That is rarely good advice," he murmured. But he moved anyway, because the system was no longer waiting politely. It was expecting. His fingers crossed the threshold, and the reaction was immediate. The column of light tightening, stabilizing, not resisting him, but adjusting to him, like a lock recognizing a key it had been designed for, but had not seen in a very long time. The symbols within the core shifted rapidly now, sequences rewriting themselves with a clarity that removed any doubt this was coincidence. And across the chamber, displays embedded into the walls flickered to life without command, projecting streams of data no one had authorized, no one could interrupt. "Override protocol," one engineer whispered, his voice thin. "That requires a lineage signature." And he stopped there, because the conclusion did not need to be spoken. Ethan felt the system settle around him, not as pressure, but as recognition, a quiet confirmation that made the air feel different, more precise, and somewhere deep in his memory, something aligned in response. Something he had spent years ignoring because it had never been necessary to understand. "You should step back," an advisor said suddenly, the first attempt at control breaking through the silence. But it came too late. The system had already moved past the point where human suggestion carried weight. Seraphina raised a hand, and the advisor fell silent instantly, her gaze never leaving Ethan, her expression no longer distant, no longer neutral, but sharpened into something intent and searching. "Continue," she said. And this time there was no ambiguity, no space for retreat. Ethan almost laughed, not because it was amusing, but because of the timing, because this was exactly the kind of moment people spent entire lives avoiding, and somehow he had walked into it in under an hour. He placed his hand fully against the core, and the response was immediate and undeniable. The lights surged, not violently, but decisively, patterns locking into place, the chamber brightening by degrees that felt measured rather than dramatic. And then, in a voice that did not come from any visible source, but from the system itself, clear and precise, a single designation formed, not loud, not forced, but absolute in a way that left no room for interpretation, and the word was not translated, not softened. It was understood directly by everyone present, as if the system had chosen clarity over courtesy, and in that moment, the palace did not react. It stilled completely, as if the entire structure had paused to confirm what it had just acknowledged about him. The word did not echo. It settled, and that was worse, because echoes fade but certainty remains, and the chamber absorbed it with a kind of quiet that felt deliberate, as if even the air understood it had just been given something it could not undo. Ethan did not pull his hand away immediately, not because he was trying to prove anything, but because the system had not released him yet, and forcing distance from something that clearly recognized him seemed like a poor negotiation strategy. The light around his hand stabilized, no longer shifting, no longer searching. It had found what it was looking for, and now it held, precise and steady, like a statement that did not require repetition. Behind him, someone exhaled slowly, the sound sharp in the stillness, and then quickly stopped as if realizing that even breathing might be interpreted as commentary. Seraphina stepped forward into the edge of the light, not touching it, but close enough that the glow traced along the edges of her form, outlining the controlled tension in her posture, the subtle shift in her stance that suggested she was no longer observing from a distance but engaging with something she had not anticipated. "Say it again," one of the advisors whispered, not to Ethan, not even to the Queen, but to the system itself, as if repetition might make the moment easier to categorize. But the system did not respond, because it did not need to. It had already been clear. Ethan finally withdrew his hand, slowly, carefully, as if testing whether the recognition would follow him or remain where it had been given. And when the light did not collapse, did not dim, but instead adjusted slightly to maintain its alignment with him, the implication became impossible to ignore. "That is not how authorization works," the engineer said, his voice steadier now, but only because disbelief had begun to harden into something more analytical, more dangerous. "It does not adapt." Ethan glanced at him briefly, then back at the core. "It does if it was never designed to reject," he said, and the answer sounded less like a theory and more like a memory he had decided to phrase politely. Seraphina's gaze shifted between him and the system, her expression no longer neutral, no longer even controlled in the same way. Something sharper had taken its place, not emotion, not yet, but recognition of a different kind, the kind that rearranged priorities without asking. "You knew," she said, and this time it was not a question, not an accusation, something more precise, a conclusion she had reached and was now testing against his response. Ethan considered denying it, because denial was often the simplest path through complicated situations, but the system behind him pulsed once, quiet, deliberate, as if reminding him that simplicity was no longer an option. "I suspected," he said instead, because that was close enough to the truth to be useful without being entirely complete. The court shifted again, but this time the movement was restrained, cautious, the kind that followed a realization rather than a command, and the distance between Ethan and the rest of the room became more pronounced, not physically, but socially, as if an invisible boundary had been drawn and everyone was suddenly aware of it. Seraphina took another step forward, closing that distance on her own terms, her voice lowering just enough that it felt directed only at him despite the audience surrounding them. "You are not here by accident," she said, and there was no room left in the statement for negotiation. Ethan allowed himself the smallest hint of a smile, not dismissive, not arrogant, just tired in a way that suggested he had considered that possibility long before she had. "I have been told that before," he replied quietly. "It usually means things are about to get complicated." And for the first time since the ceremony began, the corner of Seraphina's expression shifted, not quite a smile, not quite anything that could be easily named, but enough to suggest that whatever she had expected from this arrangement, it was no longer sufficient. And somewhere deep within the palace, systems that had been dormant for generations began to wake in sequence, responding not to commands. But to him the palace did not return to normal, it adjusted, and that was worse. Because normal implied stability, while adjustment meant something fundamental had shifted and was still in the process of deciding what came next. Ethan felt it in the way the air carried sound differently now, as if the structure itself had begun prioritizing certain frequencies, certain voices, and he had a quiet suspicion about which ones were being elevated. The core remained active behind him, no longer searching, no longer uncertain, its lights steady and aligned, a silent confirmation that did not require repetition. Seraphina stood closer than before, well within the boundary that separated observer from participant, and the court noticed, because courts always noticed proximity, especially when it broke pattern. "All secondary systems are initiating," one of the engineers said, his voice controlled but tight at the edges. "Without authorization," he added, as if the distinction still mattered, as if authority had not just been redefined in front of him. Along the walls, faint lines of light began to appear where there had been none before, thin seams opening like eyes adjusting to a darker room, and data streamed silently across surfaces that had not displayed anything in years, symbols aligning, cross-referencing, confirming. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, not stepping back, not stepping forward, just enough to remind himself he was still choosing where he stood. "That seems inefficient," he said quietly, almost conversational. Usually systems like to ask first. A few heads turned toward him, not in challenge, but in something closer to expectation, as if they were beginning to suspect he might have more answers than anyone else in the room. Serafina did not look away from him, her attention fixed, measured, the earlier distance gone entirely, replaced by a focus that felt intentional, almost personal. "It is not asking because it already knows," she said, and the statement settled into the space between them with a certainty that left little room for interpretation. Ethan considered that, then gave a small nod. "That would explain the lack of paperwork," he replied, and for a fraction of a second, something in her expression shifted again, a subtle softening that did not weaken her presence but altered its direction, less distant, more engaged. Behind them, an advisor stepped forward, unable to remain silent any longer. "Your Majesty." This individual was not cleared for any form of integration. "His presence here is strictly contractual." The words were precise, carefully chosen, but they sounded smaller now, reduced by the context they were trying to control. Serafina raised her hand slightly, not sharply, not dramatically, but enough, and the advisor stopped mid-sentence, the interruption immediate and complete. "He is no longer just contractual," she said, her voice calm, but carrying a new weight, one that did not come from tradition but from recognition, and the court absorbed that. As well, the hierarchy recalibrating in real time. Ethan glanced at her then, more directly than before, studying the change with the same quiet attention he had given the system, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching, not uncomfortable, not uncertain, but deliberate, as if both were aware that whatever came next would define the terms of everything that followed. Somewhere above them, the ceiling lights adjusted, not brighter, not dimmer, but clearer, removing the soft ambient glow and replacing it with something more precise, more focused, as if the room itself had decided it wanted to see more clearly. "Ethan Blake," Serafina said again, his name no longer an afterthought, no longer a label attached to an agreement, but something acknowledged, something chosen. "You will not leave this chamber." And it was not a command in the traditional sense, not enforced by guards or threat, but by the simple fact that the system behind him had already made that decision, and the palace had agreed. And for the first time since he arrived, Ethan realized that whatever role he had been assigned when he walked in no longer applied, and whatever came next would not be optional. The chamber did not release its attention, it tightened it, focusing inward as if every system, every observer, every quiet calculation had converged on a single variable that refused to return to its assigned place. And Ethan felt that focus settle around him with a clarity that made movement feel like a decision rather than an option. He shifted his hand slightly at his side, not out of discomfort, but to confirm something simple, that he was still in control of at least that much. And the realization was mildly reassuring in a room that had just decided otherwise. The walls continued their silent activity, streams of data moving in patterns too deliberate to be random, aligning across surfaces that had remained dormant for generations, and each sequence ended the same way, not with a command, not with a question, but with a confirmation that pointed back to him. "Containment protocols are disengaged," one of the engineers said, his voice quieter now, less certain, as if the words themselves had become unreliable. "They are not responding to manual override." And that statement carried more weight than he intended, because it implied the system was no longer interested in being managed. Serafina stepped fully into the light this time, crossing the boundary without hesitation, and the core did not resist her presence, but it did not adjust for her either. Its alignment remained fixed on Ethan, and the distinction was subtle but unmistakable. She studied the patterns, then him, then the space between them, her expression composed but no longer distant. The calculation in her gaze replaced by something more immediate, something that required less analysis and more acceptance. "This system answers to lineage," she said, her voice measured, but carrying a depth that suggested she was not speaking to the court anymore. And it has chosen to answer to you. The final words settled differently, not as a label, but as a conclusion. Ethan exhaled slowly, glancing once at the core, then back at her. I do not remember signing up for that, he replied, the dry edge of humor still there, quieter now, not deflecting, just grounding the moment in something familiar. A few members of the court shifted, not in disagreement, but in the subtle recalibration that followed any shift in power, and the distance between them and Ethan grew again, not physically, but in the way people measured proximity to something they did not yet understand. You do not need to remember, Seraphina said, taking another step closer, now standing within arm's reach, her presence no longer separated by formality or distance, because the system does. And there was something in her tone now that had not been there before, not softness, not yet, but recognition layered with something quieter, something that suggested this moment was not entirely unexpected to her. Ethan met her gaze, holding it for a fraction longer than before, not challenging, not yielding, just acknowledging the shift between them. That is usually where things become inconvenient, he said, and for the first time, her expression changed in a way that could not be mistaken, a slight curve at the edge of her composure, not quite a smile, but close enough to alter the atmosphere between them. Behind them, the core pulsed once more, not brighter, not louder, but final, and the data across the walls resolved into a single unified sequence, the palace systems synchronizing in response. And then, in a motion so subtle it almost went unnoticed, the light surrounding Ethan expanded outward just enough to include her as well, not fully, not equally, but deliberately, as if the system had made a second decision, one that did not replace the first but built on it. The room held its breath again, but this time it was different, less about shock, more about anticipation, as if something larger had just begun and no one present was entirely sure where it would end. The light did not expand further. It settled around them with a quiet precision that suggested the system had completed a calculation no one else had been aware of, and the chamber absorbed that conclusion in a silence that no longer felt uncertain but inevitable. Ethan stood still within it, aware now that the space he occupied was no longer defined by where he had been placed, but by something that had chosen him without consultation, and for the first time, he considered that leaving might not be as simple as walking toward the nearest exit. Seraphina remained within the edge of that same light, not fully encompassed, but no longer excluded, her posture unchanged yet entirely different, as if the distinction between observation and participation had dissolved without requiring her permission. It is integrating contextual variables, one of the engineers said, his voice carefully neutral, as though neutrality might restore control to a situation that had moved beyond it. Adjusting parameters based on, he stopped, not because he did not know how to finish the sentence, but because finishing it would make it real. Ethan glanced at the shifting patterns, now slower, more deliberate, as if the system was no longer searching for answers but organizing them, based on recognition, he said quietly, and the correction landed with a weight that removed any ambiguity. A faint movement passed through the court, not quite a reaction, more like the collective realization that the rules they understood were no longer sufficient to explain what was happening in front of them. Seraphina turned her head slightly toward him, studying his expression with a focus that had nothing to do with ceremony and everything to do with understanding. You are not surprised, she said, and this time there was no distance left in her voice, only clarity. Ethan considered that for a moment, then allowed a small, almost reluctant smile to surface. I am choosing not to be, he replied, because surprise implied lack of preparation, and he had learned a long time ago that the universe rarely waited for anyone to be ready. The light pulsed once more, softer now, and the data across the walls resolved into a final configuration, lines of information aligning into a structure that resembled less a command and more a declaration, and though no voice spoke, the meaning carried through the room with unmistakable precision, not as language, but as understanding. Seraphina stepped closer, closing the remaining distance until she stood directly in front of him, her gaze level, unwavering, and for a brief moment, the rest of the chamber seemed to recede, not physically, but in relevance. This changes the nature of our agreement, she said, and the statement was not framed as a question, not even as a proposal, but as an acknowledgement of a shift that had already occurred. Ethan let out a slow breath, glancing once at the core behind him, then back at her. That was already happening, he said, and the honesty in it did not challenge her authority, it aligned with it. Her expression softened, just slightly, not enough to diminish her presence, but enough to reveal that whatever calculation she had been making, it had reached a conclusion she was willing to accept. You were never meant to be a political solution, she said quietly, and the words carried more weight than the decree she had signed earlier, because this time, they were not for the court, not for the empire, but for him. Around them, the palace system stabilized, not shutting down, not returning to dormancy, but holding steady, as if awaiting further instruction from a source they had only just recognized. And in that stillness, the court understood something without needing it spoken, that the human who had arrived as an obligation was no longer defined by that role, and whatever came next would not be decided by tradition alone, and somewhere beyond the chamber, deeper within the structure, something ancient continued to wake, as if this moment had not been the end of a process, but the beginning of something far larger than any of them had prepared for.